Welcome to Off Protocol, the podcast that takes a closer look at the world of clinical trials. Each episode will pull back the curtain on clinical research, exploring what works, what doesn't, and what happens when things go a little off protocol.
Hi, my name is Zara Liew, and I'll be your guest host for this episode. Today, we're talking about an issue that's both common and often overlooked: heavy menstrual bleeding. Despite affecting an estimated 20 to 30% of women at some point in their lives, research in this area has historically lagged far behind. So, why the gap? And what will it take to design clinical trials that truly reflect women's lived experiences? Joining me is Dr. Michelle Griffin, founder of MFG Health Consulting and a women's health expert advisor for Lindus Health. Michelle is a leading advocate for evidence-based innovation in women's health, and she's also releasing a new book on heavy menstrual bleeding. Michelle, welcome to Off Protocol. So, to start, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to focus on women's health, particularly heavy menstrual bleeding?
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Zara. It's so lovely to be on your podcast today. And I'd love to tell you a little bit more about myself. So, as you said, I'm the founder of MFG Health, and that is a consultancy that helps women's health founders and CEOs turn clinical innovation into commercial success. And so the key thing for me in the work that I do, and as well as in advising Lindus Health, is that we actually do it on very much data and evidence and using clear strategy to really understand what's the clinical need and how do we make that into a viable business model. So it really fits with the product market and you get a real scalable roadmap to like, how do we actually get successful? Because that's really the only way that you're going to be able to grow businesses and that they then have an impact and raise the standard of healthcare for women. But I didn't just jump into this. I had a career very much of two phases. The first was in obstetrics and gynecology, working in hospitals across the UK, providing specialist women's healthcare. And that included everything from obstetrics to fertility, infertility, gynae cancers, incontinence, menstrual health problems. And then I moved out of that clinical patient-facing job into more looking at healthcare systems and standard of healthcare services. And that took me into public health, World Health Organization, Cancer Research UK, and more recently into health tech spheres, working in hardware and software. And I think the big thing that really came to me is by bringing those two parts of my life together, I could really see that there was a massive need for clinical and commercial expertise of women's health. Because as I said, you need to have that to be able to raise the standard of healthcare that women will receive, and in that way improve health outcomes. And one of the big issues that we don't really speak about, and there is a massive underinvestment and lack of research, is in heavy menstrual bleeding, because women have periods, women do bleed, and therefore any issues related to that is just seen to be, oh, that's all got to be part of normal, which I'm sure we'll be diving into more today.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I think we work together tons at Lindus Health, but I don't think I've heard the full story. And for the purpose of this audience, before we go deep into the conversation, let's just level set. What do we mean by heavy menstrual bleeding? Clinically, how is it defined? And what kind of impact does it have on women's daily lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really important not only for this audience, but just for society as a whole, because, I look at my daughters and they're not being taught about this, let alone the boys in the classroom. And that's at primary and secondary school. So how can we then expect a woman who is struggling with heavy menstrual bleeding to actually see it in themselves if we're not talking about it generally? And it's really interesting, the history actually around heavy menstrual bleeding, because when I first started training as a doctor and specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, it was very much taught to us then that there's a clinical definition. It's a very clear textbook definition, as we say. And that seemed to be bleeding more than 80 milliliters. But the big question that struck me then and still does is, who, how, and where are women measuring how much they bleed? And then being able to come in and say, well, during this period, I bled this much, but during this period, I bled this much. And, it's just not realistic. It's not feasible. And so that definition has definitely kind of gone by the wayside, and we've become much more modernized in the way that we think about things in medicine in general. And it's really good to see that heavy menstrual bleeding has been taken in under that umbrella. So when we used to talk about, well, how much are you bleeding? And we made it a little bit more realistic by saying, what were the clots? So the lumps of blood that people were passing, what were the size of them? But realistically, what we're now saying to them is it's very simple. Heavy menstrual bleeding is defined as anyone who is bleeding so much that it impacts their life. And what I love about that definition is there's no one standard. It's not that this is a very small area, that if you're above that, then yes, you're heavy menstrual bleeding. And if you're below, then you're not. It's taking into account a much more personalized view of women in medicine and saying, what is impacting you in your life? Because your life will be very different to my life. And I may be able to manage much less bleeding because of the type of work I do or the type of family I have compared to what you could manage. And so it's, what does it affect? And so when we then think about how does something impact you? Yes, you're bleeding for sure. But is it impacting you in a way that you're worried and you sleep quite lightly because you're worried you're going to fill your pad or whichever period product you're using? Are you worried that you're leaking into your bed sheets, or do you wake because you've leaked into the bed sheets? If that's happening on a regular occasion, and all I mean by that is more than once or twice, then yes, that's heavy menstrual bleeding because it's impacting your ability to sleep. Similarly, if you feel like you can't go into the office or into the shop where you work because you're so worried about how much you're bleeding, because you can't change your pads enough, because when you stand up, having sat down at your desk for a couple of hours, that you then leak or you flood, then all of that is impacting your life quite clearly. So we define that as heavy menstrual bleeding.
Yeah, I really like that approach of being way more about the person as a whole, which is actually just very different to clinical trials where they say you really need to define exactly, this is who is defined as heavy menstrual bleeders. But I guess we'll get into kind of the trial topics and maybe discuss a little of that, disconnect there. But just also starting with the basics, what are some of the main causes of heavy menstrual bleeding? And why do you think so many women still struggle to get an accurate diagnosis or effective treatment? I can imagine it's a lot of conversation around, well, this is just a part of life. It's a part of being a woman. These kinds of, topics are not necessarily talked about that much. So yeah, would love to hear your opinion.
Definitely. It's such a big problem is the fact that basically, because periods are expected, and as I say, we're not talking about them, about what is what we would expect versus what people experience, and that disconnect there, that every woman who has a period, no matter how much they bleed, for how long they bleed, for how much it impacts them, they're all susceptible to be feeling, oh, this has got to be normal. Like my friends say they bleed and I bleed, so this is all normal. And so that is one of the biggest barriers to actually help women recognize that actually, if it's impacting your life, then that's something that you need to seek medical help for. When we think about causes, I am a stickler. You've got to identify the cause for your heavy menstrual bleeding, because if you don't know the cause, then this is where it can really trigger an awful kind of set of events where women just go almost bouncing around one treatment to the other to the other. Now, whilst I completely understand and have done so, there are many women, as I've treated, said, I don't know exactly what treatment's going to work for you. So there's going to be some trial and error there. That is different to saying, I have no idea what I'm trying to treat. And so I'm going to try lots of different things, a smorgasbord, and hope that something works. That's not a good way to practice medicine. So you've got to be looking at what are the causes for the heavy menstrual bleeding. And there are lots of them, and they may not all be related to actually what I would call a reproductive cause. So something to do with the gynecological organs like the ovaries or the womb. The biggest cause of heavy menstrual bleeding, though, when we look at everything, is fibroids. It's affecting over 70% of women worldwide. And fibroids are growths inside the womb. And they are benign in that they're not cancer, but they're not benign in that they cause so many problems. And one of the biggest issues is they cause heavy menstrual bleeding.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good segue to another topic. So, congratulations, you're
Thank
releasing
you.
a new book focused on fibroids and women's experiences with heavy bleeding. So, take us through the journey. What inspired you to write it? And what are your hopes in terms of helping bridge the gap between the clinical understanding and women's lived experiences with it?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest motivation for me, I have to say, is in all honesty, I was never a person who had a book on my bingo card, as people like to say. It wasn't something that I could see in my destiny. And definitely not like 20 years ago when I was practicing doctor, thinking, oh, this is where I would be 20 years fast forward. But I think it's very much something that makes sense right now because there is a lot of momentum in women's health. And I love to see that. But what I also see is there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of confusion and overwhelm. And underneath all of that is that women are still being dismissed. The key that unlocks all of these problems is if women understood and had more knowledge and had things explained to them. And ideally, that would be right back at the beginning, but it's meeting where that woman is right now, whatever age she is, whether she's trying for a baby, whether she's postnatal, whether she's just living her life, whether she's looking at contraception, whether she's premenopausal, postmenopausal, whether she's perimenopausal. There's so many phases of our life cycle as a
Mhm.
woman. And it's like meeting her and saying, look, fibroids can affect you from the moment that you hit puberty all the way until you die. They're not so common post-menopause, but they're not completely unusual. And so it's something that is with women potentially for the whole of their life course from puberty. And yet most people don't know what I'm talking about when I say about fibroids. And they have so much impact on women. I just really wanted to bridge and say, look, I'm a doctor with the expertise, with the knowledge, with the experience. Let me be that doctor in your pocket via a book who has your back, who can tell you the truth about what we know and what we don't yet know because we haven't got all the answers. But I can also do it in a way that describes and explains what's going on. So you no longer feel like you keep walking out of a doctor's office, telling your friends, telling your family, saying, look, I just don't know. I've got
Mhm.
more questions still than I have got answers. But instead, you say, look, at long last, someone's walked me through this and explained to me exactly what's going on, why things are happening. And therefore, I can feel, hopefully, that reader's feeling more confident and empowered with their knowledge. And they can start to say, look, I actually know what's going on. I can advocate for myself. And so I think it's really key that we address so many things in women's health. But with fibroids being so common and having such an impact, it seemed a logical place to start.
Yeah. And that's a really, inspiring mission to make sure that people feel empowered by their own body and health. And I'm sure as part of this book, you are doing a bunch of research around menstrual health as
Mm.
well as fibroids. But my understanding is that it might be a vastly under-researched area in medicine. Is that the case? But also, why do you think it's taken so long for this to be recognized as a serious clinical issue?
Yeah, I think basically it goes back to the original point of just saying, look, women do have periods, and therefore women experiencing bleeding is common. And so quickly we see in medicine, and it's really by writing this book, it's made me reflect on so much of actually my days at university and being taught medicine, because it's made you think, how did I come to the thinking that I now have? And what we got, that it wasn't explicit and obvious, but what the sense was is if something is common, it almost becomes normal. You expect things to happen. We know things are happening. We can understand the pathology. We can understand the physiology. We can work out what's going to happen. So, for example, if I look at a sequence of events, I know that if a woman delivers a baby vaginally, she's going to have some bruising and some swelling around her bladder. And so it's more than likely that she's going to struggle to wee for the first time as soon as she's delivered the baby. And that can go on for a number of hours. I expected it to happen. I fully understood it was going to happen. I was anticipating it. Yet when it happens, if I go and say, oh, that's normal, then it's sort of saying to that woman, not only do we expect it, but it's totally okay. And that woman then hears, oh, it's totally okay that I don't wee after giving birth, which of course it's not. It really isn't. But because we call normal as much as we say things are common or expected, then we start to dismiss and we start to reduce the value of somebody's experience and the impact it's having on them. And I think when we look then back to bleeding, because we say having a period is what we expect, then we say having a period is normal. And then having a heavy period, it's not really heavy, is it? It's normal. Periods will differ. People will bleed for a few days or many weeks, and all of that becomes normal. And so we don't need to think, oh, that's something we need to research. That's something we need to treat. That's something we need to better manage and understand what's going on. We just say, oh, this is just normal and part of being a woman. And not only does the woman think that, but healthcare professionals and scientists start to think that. So we need to re-correct that balance.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who has not given birth, when you said that bladder thing, I guess look forward to for hopefully new innovations in the space by the time that happens.
Be aware of, exactly. Be aware of and know that if you're not weeing in the first few hours after giving birth, then you need to shout about it. And, obviously there's things around it, but I think it's just I think that's the other side of things, that when somebody does see somebody, a doctor like myself, and say, look, I'm bleeding 2 to 3 weeks out of every month, and I'm having to wear double protection. So I'm wearing 2 types of period products, and I don't sleep that well, and I'm soaking through all of my clothes. And I can then do an investigation and say, look, let's work out what's going on, because this isn't okay. This is obviously not okay. This is obviously having a major impact on you. But more importantly and excitingly is we can do so much about it. It's not so much that, we can definitely do research, understand more, and come up with new treatments. But I just feel if women currently could access a lot more of the treatments that are currently available, that would be a significant step forward. But I am, of course, mindful of if we could make those treatments more effective and more accessible, in that, they're easier to take or easier to do, then of course, that will only be a good thing as well.
Switching gears a bit, let's talk about the research side. So you've closely been involved in advising heavy menstrual bleeding trials here at Lindus. I think we probably work directly with each other, perhaps on this as well. But what are some of the scientific or logistical challenges you've seen firsthand in menstrual health research?
Yeah, I think going back to your point, there is a disconnect because, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is this disconnect, because decades ago, we were all working on this clinical definition of heavy menstrual bleeding. And if you just threw that out into the public and say, look, I'm trying to recruit women for a heavy menstrual bleeding clinical trial, and you need to be bleeding more than 80 milliliters. What do you think, Zara? I don't think anybody would sign up to that. As a gynecologist myself, I wouldn't even know if that was me or not. I have no clue, as you say. So I think one of the biggest challenges is, when we look at the regulators who are going to need to sign off the data and say, look, we are happy that your intervention, so your new diagnostic test or your new treatment, is actually effective and safe, then they're going to say, look, the outcome needs to be is that it helps women who have heavy menstrual bleeding. But they're still very much wanting to see the evidence based on older definitions. And so there is this disconnect. There is a mismatch between trying to recruit women and actually show that there's an impact on women who ultimately will be saying to them, doctors, I want to try this new treatment because I've seen that treatment will, help me and will reduce my bleeding, they're not really referring to what the regulators are saying. This is what we've seen in the evidence. And of
Mhm.
course, that is the case across all clinical trials. When you look at new treatments, they don't go to market with what the data they've submitted to regulators. But I think when we look at women's health, it still is quite old fashioned in how we
Yeah.
view it. And there isn't enough of an emphasis on an actual patient's outcome. And I think also another big challenge, which is particularly pertinent to looking at patient outcomes, is a lot of when we talk about healthcare in women is actually addressing chronic conditions. So they're not
Mhm.
necessarily going to be the conditions that push a woman to go into A&E on a regular basis, or being an inpatient, or necessarily having the most complicated surgery. It is interventions that we could be looking at being done in primary care with primary care physicians or in an office gynae setup.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, what we're looking at is what's an outcome that will address a problem that a woman would typically go and see these doctors for. So things like, I'm bleeding so much it's affecting my sleep, or I'm carrying so much anxiety around my bleeding and it's really affecting my mental well-being. Those are the outcomes that we should be pushing for. And there is that disconnect at the moment.
And I really like the outcomes you mentioned, because on the trials that we've scoped out, and I think you've helped us with a couple of these ones where it is logistically challenging. So, for example, using the PBAC score, which using pictures of how, I guess, full your pad is or full your tampon is can be subjective. But likewise, the alternative is actually collecting those pads and sending it off to a lab, which is also a logistical nightmare. Or you have to come in on the second day of your period to a
Yes.
clinic where, yes, I get it that, periods can be to an extent regular, when it's coming, but, dropping everything at the drop of a hat on day 1, 2 to, get into a clinic ASAP, if they even have availability for you at that site, can be challenging.
Oh, exactly. And when you think about it, if you're doing any study in heavy menstrual bleeding, you're going to want to review that patient, whether it be looking at whatever your intervention is, but you're going to be wanting to see that patient during the time of their bleeding. And so, like you said, like day 2 of a period, but you're not going to just want to do that on your next period or on the next period that you can make it into the clinic on day 2. You're going to say, I want to do it probably at least 3 periods, maybe even 6 periods, or maybe longer. And so you've then got to say that the woman's got to sign up to say, look, I'm going to come to you, whatever the day, whatever the time, every period on day 2. It's very, very difficult. It's incredibly challenging. And so this is what I'm saying. It's a bigger issue around the fact of realizing that when you're trying to do something in women's health, in particular with around periods, and in this instance, heavy menstrual bleeding, you've got to take into consideration that what you might so easily write down on a protocol of go to
Mhm.
your nearest clinic on day 2, what does that actually look like for the woman who is going into work, who's not going to get leave for this? And when I was thinking about this podcast, I was thinking about the juxtaposition with something like another condition that would have a very different setup with the clinical trial. And so for another condition that isn't maybe so much of a chronic ongoing thing, such as heavy menstrual bleeding that's gone on for years potentially, then that person may have actually stopped work. They may have carers with friends or family, or even a professional carer. They may have support. If we look at cancer trials, for example, there's a lot of funding that's given to say, you'd be part of this cancer trial, we'll pay for your transport in and back out. We're not expecting you to work. You've
Mhm.
got time to input the data. Now, compare that to a woman who's got 2 children, who's going to work Monday to Saturday, who maybe works night shifts, that they've got 1 car in the family and she takes the car to work, but then needs to drop it back home for a partner to use the car. And then on day 2, she is expected to drop all of this and not even recognize when her day 2 is coming, because it may not be predictable. She may have irregular periods. and then just suddenly say, yeah, I can drop all of this and head off to the clinic. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible. And so I think a bigger recognition of what you're actually asking is really needed. But these are all challenges that can be, overcome. It just requires really clever planning and really understanding that experience of the woman.
And another issue that often comes up is representation. So making sure we include women across different ages, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic groups. How can trial design better reflect that diversity, especially in menstrual health studies, and especially when women are underrepresented as is in clinical trials, and getting them to get involved?
Yeah, health equity is very, very difficult. And, there is a massive imbalance. And therefore, unsurprisingly, we see exactly what we see in healthcare services provision and the uptake of healthcare services, and who follows through, who continues with it, who accesses it in the first place. We see that exactly play out when it comes to clinical trials and research. And so there is a massive problem with underrepresentation in women's health. And heavy menstrual bleeding, as I said, the leading cause is fibroids. And, unfortunately, people of certain socioeconomic backgrounds, but also ethnic populations, so particularly Black women, are most at risk of having fibroids and having really intense, severe complications and symptoms related to their fibroids. And we don't fully understand why. But what we definitely know is that this particular group has to be included in any study with heavy menstrual bleeding, because to completely not include them or not adequately represent them, then we just might as well not do the study, because you're not really looking at the people who are going to be impacted, who actually are suffering and therefore need the help. And so one way to combat that is just make it really clear and straightforward about who you are looking for and why, and take away any medical jargon. Don't make it vague. Make it really clear and speak in a way that speaks to what the woman would be experiencing. So don't talk about, are you bleeding more than 80 mils? Talk about the fact that, are you needing to use a tampon and a period pad? Are you talk about the fact that you're maybe wearing double layer underwear, that you're putting down towels on your bed at nighttime, that you don't go into, you're missing work because of your periods. Those are signs that are clearly telling me that you have heavy periods. And that's not comprehensive. I'm not saying everybody has to experience that to have heavy periods, but I'm just saying there are really clear signals that you are struggling with heavy periods. And therefore, you are exactly the type of person that I'm trying to recruit into this study. So it's speaking to them in very clearly, to the women that you're trying to recruit, and making it really easy for those women to be part of this.
Yeah, it's, really understanding this patient-centric approach and putting yourself in their shoes as well. When you design a clinical trial, I know for trials where we've done postpartum depression, childcare is a major factor into whether people participate in the trial or not, and making that easy. And we appreciate everyone takes part in our trials, but we also have to understand that there can be a burden associated with taking part that money cannot compensate for when you take part in trials.
Definitely. That's such a good point. And I think what's a really interesting point here, and a sort of nuance, I suppose, is the fact that when you talk about this burden, is also looking at, is the burden potentially going to worsen the actual issue that you're trying to improve? So when you talked about the postnatal depression, to then add into the fact that just the logistics of trying to organize childcare, just saying, here's some money for you to organize childcare, if that woman is struggling to care for herself and her baby, to then say, oh, you now need to leave that baby and you need to organize childcare, you're not only are you putting a burden on her, you're making that burden particularly bad because it's really playing into the condition that she's already struggling with. And when you think of heavy menstrual bleeding, if you're saying, come to us on day 2, that might be the very heaviest day that she bleeds, and she already knows it. And she'll be thinking to herself, is there any other day I could come other than my first 2 days? And maybe that's not the case, and that's fine. But could we then come to you? Do you really need to bring that woman into the clinic out of that place that she knows, potentially on a long drive where she then doesn't have easy access to the toilet with her products, with her spare clothes? Let's really think about that lived experience and say, oh, I wonder why so many women don't want to come into a trial with heavy menstrual bleeding when we're asking them to drive 5 hours during their heaviest day of bleeding. Like, it's not rocket science, and yet we just don't acknowledge and recognize what the consequences are of what we're asking women to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's so true. And when we look beyond the research, what is the real world impact of not getting this right? So, how does underdiagnosed or undertreatment of heavy menstrual bleeding affect women's lives and the healthcare system as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest impact on a woman really is that it completely changes her life. And the when and I'm not underestimating that when I say that. And I have evidence of that because when you actually successfully treat heavy menstrual bleeding and the cause of that for a woman, so that she goes to a point where her periods are less, or potentially she doesn't have periods, depending on what treatment you're doing and how effective it is, she comes back as a completely different woman. But what she says to you is, this is how I thought I would be. This is what I've wanted to be. This is the work I would want to be doing. This is the type of exercise. This is the socializing. I'm getting great sleep. I can exercise. My mental health is so much better. I want to go out with my friends. I want to have a relationship with my partner. I'm going back and I'm having sex again. All of these things because you fix the heavy menstrual bleeding. This is how revolutionary it is. And therefore, when you say, what kind of impact does it have on a woman? It completely changes her life around. It completely turns it around. But then when you say, look, if I do that not only to this one individual woman, but I do it to all the women who are struggling with heavy menstrual bleeding, all the women who have fibroids, which is, we say over 70 to 80% of women have fibroids. No, not all of those women will be struggling with it, but a large percentage of that. So suddenly you look at your workforce in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and how many women are in the workforce, which I believe in the UK, there's more women than men in the workforce at the moment. And you say, I could potentially turn it around and make their lives so much better. It's not only great for that individual woman, but also the workplace when you're thinking about the lost productivity, but also just the family and the society as a whole. The fact that that woman could show up and be what she wants to be is so significant that it's very hard to kind of reduce that down to a nice one sentence quantitative answer. But it really is, it's too hard to put a value on how much change you can make.
Yeah, I know. I just came from a women's health conference actually this morning, and the way to kind of speak to things is in the economic value. And they kind of pinned it in that way where, women and solving women's health issues just improves workplace productivity, presenteeism, absenteeism, and with them being, in many cases, the pillars of family, improving child health benefits as well.
Definitely. Yeah, money talks. Like, there's no denying that. And I'm happy that's the way that the world works. It always has done. And for the foreseeable, it seems to be working like that. And I'm very happy to jump into that. I just recognize that there's bigger impact. But when we look at money alone, I did some work last year with the NHS Confederation where we looked exactly at this. What are the economic impact? And so in the UK, it was based on data in the UK, we found that for every £1 spent in women's healthcare in the UK, and that was at a very bigger level. It didn't have to be only like more GPs or more appointments. It was at the bigger level. We actually saw 11 to £13 return of investment.
Wow.
And when we look at other things, because number one, that sounds great, but I always like to provide context because it's quite difficult to think, well, I don't know, maybe something else might provide £100 return on investment, although that would be incredible, 100 times return on investment. But just to put this into context, when the similar study was done a few years back by NHS Confederation, and they looked at investment in primary care, so within GP services, and they said for every £1 that was invested in GP services, they would see a return of investment, looking at improved health outcomes, improved productivity, everything that we've just spoken about. That would be £4 return on investment. So that's more than triple if you put £1 into women's healthcare services. And so I think that gives you a sense of how big this opportunity is. But sadly, it also shows that how much opportunity is being missed while we continue to talk about whether it's worth it or not, and how much impact would it be have, and is it worth doing some research? Is it worth doing development in health tech, biotech, in diagnostics, in treatments, in women's health? Yeah, 100% yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's the overall echoing message from all the different conferences I go to, that it is a good ROI to invest in women's health and women's health issues. To close out, we like to do this quick segment called Trial Tales, where we share a story about a moment in clinical research that was surprising, memorable, or just a little bit different from the usual. So, Michelle, is there a moment from your work in women's health that stands out? Maybe something that reminded you of, why this research really matters. And Lindus, we love to share patient stories internally and feedback about how the trial's improving their lives. So I'd love to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, no, I love this segment. I really love it. And it's always the best bit of the podcast. So yeah, it's lovely to think, oh, what would be mine? And I think, there's always so many, isn't there, to speak to. But I think something that just happened to me recently and really kind of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about on the podcast so far is actually working on a project at the moment where we're looking at a new diagnostic in women's healthcare. And as part of that project, I was speaking to lots of doctors in various different countries. And it was really lovely to do that in a very kind of focused way, so that it wasn't months and months apart. I did it all together as a massive kind of clinical engagement piece. So I spoke to lots of doctors in different settings. So some at a hospital, some at GP services, some as in office gynae, and in lots of different countries. So they're seeing women across lots of different kind of situations in their lives. And all of them, I asked this one question when I said to them at the end, what would you need to see to want to, I've been speaking to them about talking them through this new diagnostic, what they would think about it, are they happy the way it works, and all of this. And my last question is, what would you need to see for you to want to use this diagnostic? And they all thought the diagnostic was a good idea. I should say that. But they then were like, okay, what's going to really tip me over the edge? Why would I suddenly start adopting this when we think about clinical adoption? And they all combined and said, you're asking me a question as why would I use this? So I then automatically think of all the women I would use this. And I see those actual women in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I totally get that as a clinician. And they said, the data that I need to see is what is in the research. Specifically, two things. One, who have you included in this trial? And do those people represent the type of people that I see? And those women who are experiencing life and running their life and have the same genetics in the same ethnic background, the same social economic status, and all of that. Have you really got that true representation? And whilst we talk about it, in the clinical design phase of what's going to be the representation of patients in this study, it was really great to see that doctors are saying, I really see it on that side of things. Are you showing that your study really represents who I am treating, who I am looking after, who I care about? And then secondly is I want to see the cost benefit. Mm-hmm. And those are the two things that stand out to me. And it's a kind of full circle moment, because I see that those doctors are looking after those women. They're looking for the best interests of those women. They're not going to be easily swayed by some fancy data that comes their way, but more so they want to see data from a clinical trial in research. It needs to be done. We need to do so much research to show that, yes, this works. Who does it work for? What benefit does it bring? What are the side effects? And then lastly, what is that cost benefit? And it just is a really beautiful way of thinking, yeah, this brings together everything that we're working on at Lindus Health and further afield in women's health to say, all these points are here. We just need to join these dots up. But we are all trying to do that. And it was just a really nice moment to think, okay, there's a lot of us who are trying to make this happen.
No, that is quite full circle, quite all encompassing.
Yeah, I even kind of thought, I said to this guy when he said it, first of all, and I do know him really well, actually. I said, oh, I feel a bit emotional, actually. Like, you're saying what, it was just a moment where somebody voices what you are trying to do. You're like, I want to build a clinical trial that works, that makes sense. But then I'm not going to do the trial and then try and sell it to doctors. I'm going to ask, what do the doctors need to see? And most doctors are saying, well, what do my patients need? And then we'll reverse engineer it back. And that's always where you're going to get the best clinical trial design of you're like, we worked right from where it's going to have its impact and then reverse engineered it back and said, let's design the trial like this. So it's really good to see.
Yeah. And if we look ahead, and this was very inspiring already, what gives you hope about the future of women's health research, particularly in menstrual disorders?
Oh, that's a big question. I think just what gives me hope is that overall, there is just a lot more. And what I mean by that is there's a lot more money, there's a lot more research, there's a lot more interest, there's a lot more knowledge, not only on the science and the health field, but just with women themselves. They're understanding what's going on with their bodies a little bit more. And I feel that we are reaching this tipping point where it won't feel such a slog, and we'll just start to reap as a society the rewards of all of this work and hard, like sometimes banging your head against a brick wall a bit and thinking, gosh, surely the message should get out there. Surely I don't need to convince people. Surely another woman doesn't have to go through this experience for them to be taken seriously and not dismissed. Surely they're not only offered this one option. And I feel that we are getting there. So maybe I say that I'm the eternal optimist and I'll listen to this podcast in 20 years' time and, think, I was a little bit too optimistic. But I do really feel deep down that actually it's a slow progress, but anything that's good always takes time because we're trying to make it work and there's a lot of barriers to cross. But I think I look at my mother's generation and what she went through as somebody with heavy menstrual bleeding. And then I look at my two daughters and I see what they're talking about with their teen and tween friends. And I can already see the difference there. So it is definitely improving. And I think that there's some amazing new companies with some great ideas out there. And I'm just super excited to, help them on their research and bring their products and services to market to improve the outcomes for women.
Yeah, and things are changing, and rightly so. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an incredibly insightful conversation. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, share the episode, and let us know what you'd like to explore next. Until next time, I'm Zara, and this is Off Protocol.